thank you everyone for joining today's research seminar of the Modern Sustainable Development Institute. For those who don't know me, my name is Frauke. I'm a professor of sustainability transitions at MSDI, and I will be hosting today's seminar. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm based, the Boonwurrung people, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. So I'm very pleased that today we will hear from Frauke Behrendt in our research seminar. And Frauke is currently an associate professor of transitions to sustainable mobility at Eindhoven University in the Netherlands. And I've very pleasurable memories of that place because I did my PhD there by now quite a long time ago. Frauke is currently on a sabbatical from the university, and she's visiting us at the Modern Sustainable Development Institute, but also, I should say, kindly hosted by the Mobility Design Lab at the MADA faculty. And at Eindhoven, Frauke works at Technology, Innovation and Society group. And she's got a really interesting profile for many amongst us at the interface of mobility, sustainability, and digitalization. And particular interest in micro mobility, such as e-bikes and scooters and other light electric vehicles, and how they can contribute to more sustainable mobility, in particular in urban environments. And before she joined Eindhoven University, I should say she was a deputy head of School for Research and Enterprise at the University of Brighton, where she was also the founding director of the Center for Digital Media Culture. So you can already tell from all of this that Frauke is a very interdisciplinary scholar, and that's usually also what we would like to have in these research seminars. So it's a really, really good fit. Before I hand over to Frauke, a few practicalities. We haven't really discussed how long you will speak, Frauke, but usually it's about somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes, so that we'll have some time afterwards for some Q&A. And everyone, please feel free to think of questions and raise them after the presentation, either in the chat, but given it's a fairly small group, we can also use the raise your hand function, and then you can speak and ask your question yourself. So with that, I'm pleased to hand over the floor to Frauke.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction, Rob, and thanks everyone else for joining today. Indeed, if you want to say something, please just switch on your mic, because with the Zoomorama here on my screen, I'm not really sure I can see raised hands or chats at the moment. So probably switching on your mic is the best way forward. I really look forward to our discussion afterwards. And what I'll share with you today is based on a recent large funding application that I submitted. It's a European Research Council application on the topic of global micromobilities. So it's a little bit of a sort of research agenda for the work that me and my group are currently developing and planning to do over the next few years. But I'm also going to draw a little bit on my previous research, so you can also get a little bit of an idea of the work that I've done over the last few years. And the view of the talk is really to give you a little bit of a sense of the transition from my previous work to the future work I'm in at the moment. And I'd really also like to explore potential future collaborations. Okay, let's see if I can make these slides move and make a start. So we all know about the urgency to decarbonize transport, and currently electric cars take center stage in debates on lowering transport emissions in policy, industry, and academia. However, electric cars alone cannot reduce emissions quick enough, and they bring new justice issues such as affordability, putting chargers on pavements, or battery-related mining and disposal. In the global south, with increasing urbanization and car ownership, issues around electric cars are even more exacerbated. Therefore, I argue that micromobility matters because it is much lower in carbon emissions than electric cars per trip, but also in terms of organizing lives around shorter trips and combining with public transport for longer ones. We see many innovations around micromobility. The sudden popularity of electric step scooters saw cities scrambling to adjust. Most of Bangladesh's rickshaw fleet became electric in recent years, despite government bans. The term micromobility itself is relatively new and still contested, covering a range of lightweight mobilities that are fully or partially powered by humans and/or motors. And you can see some examples on the slide here. Micromobility also matters in terms of justice, being more affordable and operating with lighter infrastructure, but also around road safety and their perception. Are they trendy or for the poor? Micromobility includes many things that don't fit into current categories. Are e-bikes non-motorized? Are rickshaws electric vehicles? If we really want to create a low carbon and just mobility future, I argue it's urgent to produce a detailed and integrated understanding of micromobility. So my research proposes a paradigm shift to consider micromobilities a central pathway to sustainable mobility, rather than the current focus on electric cars. Now, while there is an emerging body of research on micromobilities, it is largely fragmented and very vehicle-specific. It is poorly connected to relevant scholarship on non-motorized transport or e-mobility, and very global north-centric. And my recent and future work addresses these issues by developing a novel conceptualization of micromobility that integrates and significantly extends the knowledge base around micromobilities. And my approach to micromobilities considers multi-system transitions. As Rob already flagged up earlier, I really like to work interdisciplinary. So I'm looking at the intersection of mobility with energy and ICT, and I'm also taking a justice perspective. And here I'm also taking a global approach, including the global south. And for some of the work, I propose a sensory and embodied approach to really get at micromobility experiences and social practices. For example, how do people use their bodies to drive, and how do they experience traffic risks? The ping of a rickshaw booking confirmation, breathing polluted air. What does it tell us about justice, about sustainability? How can empirical research in the global south inform micromobility research and policy at a global level? Those are some of the questions I'm setting out to explore. And some of you might ask yourselves after this introduction, where does this thinking come from? With my background in cultural and media studies. So I just wanted to briefly start with some work I've done on micromobility in the UK over the last 10 years or so, to give you a bit of a background of how this thinking developed. So a good 10 years ago, I started the Smart e-bike project, which also led me to connect with Rob, because he was eventually also doing a smart cycling project in the Netherlands. And there we designed and implemented a fleet of 35 connected bikes that were collecting data in real time alongside interviews and surveys. And we gave out these bikes to people for 6 weeks at a time, people that were commuting to work by car, to see if that would reduce their car usage. And we were able to show that their car usage was reduced by 20%, but we were also really able to get at how the network nature of the bicycles had an influence on how people perceived their mobilities through the city. And that for me was one of the most interesting elements of this as well. If anyone is interested in more detail, I just put some of the articles on the slide here, so you can have a look in your own time. Also, before leaving the UK, I got another big grant to extend some of this work to go beyond e-bikes and look at light electric vehicles for active and digital travel. Quite a mouthful, so the acronym is ELEVATE. This is a project in collaboration with Leeds University, Brighton and Oxford, and now also Eindhoven and Dortmund. when I left the UK, I had to leave the project behind, so I'm no longer leading this, but I'm still involved. And here we are really still looking at the UK context, but interested in how a range of micromobilities could change people's travel behavior and also really reduce household carbon emissions. Because of the change in leadership and COVID and all sorts of other issues, this project is a little bit delayed, but we're actually going ahead this year with the field work, which is very exciting. So we've taken delivery of a lot of the kit we are going to give out to households in Brighton, Oxford, and Leeds this year, accompanied by some big survey work. So watch this space. In the meantime, we've been working on an article to really rethink how micromobility is conceptualized. And we did a bit of a literature review of publications on micromobility. And one of the most striking findings was that the academic literature very much relies on two definitions that are very vehicle-centric. One is by the International Transport Forum, and one is by the Society of Automotive Engineers. And you see a little visual summary of both of those here. They're very much concerned with vehicle weight and speed, which are important, but we would say they are not the only things that matter about micromobility. And interestingly enough, the Society of Automotive Engineering definition only includes modes that are motor powered, so they wouldn't include normal bicycles, walking, etc. So some of these definitions are problematic, and they're also quite narrowly defined. So we did quite a bit of work to embed micromobility really with a broader set of debates. For example, we noticed that there's very limited interaction between some of these debates as well. So for example, you can see here, active mobility debates are usually quite disconnected from light electric vehicles, or non-motorized transport debates from electric mobility debates. And we would argue, if we bring together some of these debates around this topic of micromobility, we can really break away from this kind of siloed approach that we often see in research, innovation, and policy. So we kind of build on these concepts and the intersections between these, embedding micromobility in a much broader set of literatures than we often see. Don't worry about reading all the small print on here, but what was really important to us, or is really important to us, is to have this kind of multidimensional approach to micromobility, where the kind of technology side, the vehicle side of it, is really only one of the factors that we're interested in. And then we take a much broader approach, and you can have a look in the preprint of our article. But what I do want to share with you is kind of the new definition that we're working on. And I'd also love to hear your feedback on that later, if you have any thoughts. So our definition of micromobility covers a wide range of mobility options that can typically be maneuvered by one human without motor assistance, at least for short distances. And micro is seen as a relative term in terms of energy demand, environmental impact, as well as use of road space vis-à-vis automobility. And for us, micromobility comprises both long-standing and novel forms of mobility, including fully human-powered, partially motor-assisted, and fully powered options. And it can move humans, cargo, or a combination. And current examples, many of you are probably familiar with most of these, include walking, cycling, e-bikes, speed e-bikes, step scooters, moped scooters, cargo bikes, rickshaws, wheelchairs, mobility scooters, and hoverboards. They typically don't exceed 25 kilometers an hour or 45 for faster ones, and weigh often significantly less than 350 kilos, while often providing some public health benefits. The trip length is typically less than 15 kilometers, and often quite a bit less than that. And the daily distance traveled is typically less than 80 kilometers, and again, often significantly less. But for us, micromobilities include the practices, the policies, the cultures, and the infrastructures that emerge around the use of these mobility options and that shape their uptake, including interaction with other systems such as energy and ICT. We're sort of trying to give a bit of a sense of this definition in the visual that you can see on the slide as well. Now, in the title of my talk, I particularly mentioned the kind of low carbon nature of micromobility as one of the key elements. So I want to say a little bit about that as well. So how about micromobility's potential to reduce transport-related emissions? There's a recent German study that is looking at light electric vehicles. So that is a slightly broader definition, as you can see from the blue icons on this slide. But it is really interesting because they also produced a tool that some of you might be interested to use, where you can pick and choose different mobility options to include, and you can also use data from other countries or other cities. So this is why I wanted to flag it up here. But they did this study if existing trips in Germany, all of them that could be replaced by light electric vehicles would be, then we would see a 44% reduction in transport emissions. And it's based on very solid data. On the side, I put in a few other studies that are particularly focused on micromobility as we define it as well. And there we see the potential of e-scooters to replace up to 15% of car trips, and the potential CO2 savings of shifting from car to e-bike of 12 to 50%. And then particularly around cargo bikes, e-cargo bikes, there are estimates of 10 to 30% of last mile delivery trips could be shifted. And of course, we've seen a lot of innovation and uptake, especially of micromobility for last mile urban delivery as well. But what we also want to stress is that this is not only about the kind of life cycle analysis approach. And the benefits of micromobilities, or the environmental benefits, are really beyond lowering carbon emissions per kilometer or mile of vehicle use, because this also includes the combination of micromobility with public transport, where the traditional kind of walking radius around stations or stops is really significantly extended in terms of distance, but also in terms of including that are less likely, willing, or able to walk. And this is directly relevant to a lot of urban planning debates, such as transit-oriented development. Livable cities, 15-minute cities, you know, all the kind of different ways of approaching these things, where a micromobility approach would really extend the value of current work that is very much focused on walking and cycling only. So micromobility also strongly intersects with those debates on more localized living and working, where less distance is traveled, and trends towards less office-based and more ICT-enabled working, such as this meeting. Now, so far, a lot of the work I've presented and a lot of the work I've done in the past is very Eurocentric, Western-centric, and most of it based specifically in the UK, plus the people I've been working with. And what I'm really working on at the moment is to shift from this Western European perspective towards a much more global perspective on micromobilities. Because these carbon savings potentials of micromobility that I just explained, they are really so important in the transition to low and no carbon transport. And this potential is, of course, not only relevant for countries and cities with high rates of car use, but also for those who are on a trajectory towards increased automobility, especially in the global south. And due to their range, micromobility is of particular importance in the urban context. And as you can see on the slide, and most of you probably know, the 10 fastest growing cities are all in the global south. At the same time, If we look at research on micromobility, this is a paper that came out a couple of years ago, doing a proper big analysis of all the literature, we see that the Global South is almost entirely missing in the micromobility literature. So we have this really mismatch between where I think it matters the most and where most of the research is taking place. Though Monash, I just see, is actually even name-checked here. So yeah, you're doing rather well. So therefore, my current research calls for a conceptual approach that considers the different ways micromobilities develop across the globe, and a departure from the current global north-centric analytical use of the term. And existing micromobility debates are disconnected from the scholarship on non-motorized mobility in the Global South and the rich scholarship on powered two-wheelers. And this means that the cities where electric mobility transitions are taking place earlier, faster, and more profoundly than in the Global North are overlooked by most research. And the gap concerns exactly those sites that are crucial in terms of growing urban populations and associate mobility emissions. In many Asian and Global South cities, micromobility is one of the prevalent modes of urban transport, which is neglected in the current scientific debate. And while the term Global South is of course problematic, a set of global externalities produced through colonialism, it has sparked a rich academic debate on urban informality and post-networked cities that are also highly relevant to connect to micromobility debates. And in the context of climate change, it is crucial to understand how micromobility practices and experiences could maintain and extend non-car mobilities, especially in major and growing Global South cities, and how current patterns of policymaking, infrastructure development, and its financing could shift from auto to micromobilities. Now, I want to give you a little bit of an example, and this is work that is mainly pilot work done by my colleague Jonas, and I'm working with him on writing up some of the other pilot data that he collected. One of his papers has just come out. You can have a look there. And this is work he's done in Bangladesh on the electrification of rickshaws. And just to give you a little bit of a sense, April last year, we had 678,000 electric cars in Germany, and we had 1 to 4 million electric rickshaws in Bangladesh, whereas most people would probably think about the shift to electric mobility to happen in the former. I think it's really important to look at the latter, and Jonas as well. So he did some really interesting work on how a lot of existing rickshaws were retrofitted to become electric. They've of course been around since the 1960s, always been quite marginalized form of transportation. For example, new licenses weren't issued. They were stopped in 1988. Hence, it is so difficult to know how many there are really around. But for example, there are around 1 million in Dhaka. Whereas the first kind of wave of motorizing them in the 60s was mainly around moped technology. Since the mid-2000s, we've seen rapid electrification of the fleet. There are two types. One is sort of ready-made conversion kits that are imported from China, but there's also a sort of improvised DIY approach of mixing and matching different elements, motors, lead-acid batteries, and all sorts onto the existing rickshaws. And this is interesting because it kind of fitted around the structure of the previous rickshaw businesses, makes them marginally faster than cycle rickshaws, and makes it particularly attractive for elderly and disabled pullers. The fleet operators, the Maliks, play quite an important role in this transition. But all of this, again, is a very precarious situation because most of this is illegal and quite a shadowy existence. First of all, the rickshaws themselves, and then all the ways how they are transformed into electric vehicles as well. But what is really interesting, that this is a sort of bottom-up initiative, if you want to call it that. The garages play a really key part here in terms of manufacturing, assembling, repairing, storing, and charging these vehicles. They often have a sort of mix of officially registered 3-phase electricity meters and then unofficial. I also have a single-phase one. They're kind of continuing some of the existing practices of storage, of having a lot of knowledge, having a welding shop, with some of the new forms of knowledge around the batteries and the motors that they are putting on and maintaining. And what we are really arguing is that what we see here in terms of transitioning is really a disruptive innovation. It's a disruptive innovation, and innovation is disruptive if it allows a new population of consumers at the bottom of a market to access a product or service that was historically only accessible to consumers with a lot of money or a lot of skill. Whereas this is not really the case for electric cars, what most people would call a disruptive innovation. And then in terms of the people who facilitate a lot of this innovation or of this transition, we would say here the people running the garages are really important transition intermediaries, and some of the kind of usual suspects, big organizations or local NGOs that people would often think about as transition intermediaries, they are really not that involved in this shift. And at the same time, and I think this is really interesting, the national government of Bangladesh is really outlawing a lot of these practices, and they really want to push for putting in charging infrastructure for electric cars, when last year there were 12 of them around. So really interesting about what's happening there. I also did some pilot work in Ghana last year, where it's also interesting to note that while the three-wheelers that became three-wheelers came in just over the last 5 years, and they've almost completely replaced traditional taxis, while none of these are electric at the moment. Now, my time is going quite quickly. I'm also want to say a little bit about the justice approach I'm taking here. I'll see how far I get with that. Because I think it's really important to not only think about the kind of environmental sustainability, but to really also look at the justice dimension of micromobilities. And I've just put up some of the recent work I've done in this area, and a lot of them are very intertwined also with the kind of digital or media approach that I take to mobilities. And these justice issues are, for example, around the infrastructure availability, about how safe the use is, whether they are regarded as mobility for the poor or for gentrified hipsters, how access to shared schemes might be restricted by docking stations, credit card ownership, or mobile phone data plans, how electric vehicle or other urban regulations, planning and policies support or ignore micromobilities. And here I want to quickly flag up some recent work that I've done with Mimi Scheller, kind of bringing together her work on mobility justice with some of the scholarship on data justice, which is this paper where we are currently waiting for review of our revisions. So hopefully it should be out soon. And as we all know, mobility experiences are becoming intrinsically linked with digital and data experiences, and this also includes micromobility. So being mobile involves the production, storage, and sharing of data, consciously or not, from car sensor data for diagnostics and insurance apps for driving, to ticketing apps for public transport, urban micromobility share schemes, Google Maps, fitness and well-being apps, Internet of Things sensors, or air pollution data. And this datafication of mobility raises new questions with regards to justice. What kind of inequalities emerge at the intersection of mobilities and datafication? Whose mobility gets included and excluded through data collection and sharing, and why and how? How are micromobilities enabled and restricted through data? How are access and ownership to mobility and data changing? And what about the mobility of data in relation to justice? The concept of mobility data justice links scholarship on mobility justice and data justice. And this lens of social justice helps to understand the multiple ways power and inequalities and equalities are transformed or amplified at the intersection of mobility and data. So it's a multi-scalar interdisciplinary approach for examining entanglements of mobility and data with a social justice perspective. In the paper, we talk in a little bit more detail about a distributive, a procedural, and an epistemic approach here. I'm just looking at the time. I think I'm going to be a little bit quicker here. But this distributive element is really thinking about how mobility and data are accessed, accumulated, and distributed in equal or unequal ways, and how that leads to inequitable risks and benefits distributions, and how moral subjects are constituted with relation to mobility and data. So, for example, who is considered deserving or worthy of access to various mobilities or data mobilities? Who's targeted by such data collection, surveillance, and control? And we see that very much between different modes of transport as well. Then in terms of procedural perspectives on mobility data justice, this is really exploring who participates in the decision-making and in the design of infrastructure that is relevant for the intersection of mobility and data. There's a whole big issue, of course, around data governance, processing, AI, the role of AI in that. So this is also really becoming ever more important. And then the epistemic perspective on mobility data justice really explore what counts as data and knowledge in relation to mobility and how that is applied to knowing the world. So it's really about how data systems are implicated in the production of intersectional mobilities and immobilities, including age, gender, race, sexuality, class, disability, etc. If you're interested to look at some more detail, feel free to have a look at our paper. It's also out as preprint. But broadly, I would say anyone that studies micromobilities should also keep in mind how the increasing datafication of mobility relates to social justice issues. Now, I'm going to try to conclude so that we have plenty of time for discussion and questions. What I've kind of tried to do in the last half hour is to really make an argument why micromobilities are really central pathway to sustainable mobilities, and how they can be a much more powerful way to change our mobility and transport than electric cars. And a lot of the attention, of the resources, of the infrastructure, of the funding, of the research, I feel really gets sucked up by that focus on electric cars, when I feel it is very much a continuation of our current mobilities, creating new issues around justice and partially also around environmental issues. I've also tried to make an argument why it's really important to get away from the current Western centric approach to micromobilities, and to really pay attention to a much more global perspective, and especially bring in more empirical research from the global South. And the big funding application that I mentioned at the beginning, if successful in the resubmission, would also enable me to have a larger team doing empirical work in a number of sites across the globe. I've also argued that it's not just about environmental, but also about justice considerations that are really central here. And I'm hoping that in combination with some of the kind of more digital nature of some of my work might also have been interesting for some of you. And then finally, part of the effort towards this kind of global approach to micromobilities is also the building of a network. One of the reasons why I'm here. I really hope to build up this kind of global micromobilities network and community. And I'm hoping that some of you might also be interested to become involved with that. I leave it here, and I guess I'm opening up for any questions or feedback or thoughts. And I hand back to Rob for moderation.
Thank you very much, Frauke. That was fantastic and great to learn about your research and the various directions you're taking that. Can I ask if you can stop sharing your screen so we might be able to see each other a bit better? Yeah, thank you very much. And I would really like to invite anyone who has a question or comment to perhaps use the raise your hand button at the bottom of your screen, which sits under reactions if you have not been able to find it. And I would like to maybe start with a question myself or other people are thinking about theirs. One of the things that you didn't talk that much about is sort of the delivery models and the ownership models of micromobility. And obviously we've seen quite a lot of stuff happening over the last years in terms of the sharing economy, shared mobilities, in particular sort of the platform-based approaches, often delivered through large technology companies. Not just in the developed world, but also in the global south. One of my students has been looking into shared motorcycle taxis in Indonesia, and this is it's in one way it's easy to set it aside as sort of that's not desirable because users become part of this global platform and they lose control, etc. On the other hand, it often actually leads to some kind of formalization of a practice which is fundamental to the operating of cities, but which often sort of, as you said, remains in the informality of the economy. So that makes it a bit of a challenging development. And I wonder what your views are around sort of these platform approaches to micromobility, and I guess in particular from a social justice perspective.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I guess the other thing that we found in the micromobility literature from an academic perspective, but also in a lot of kind of policy type reports, is that there's a very big focus on shared fleets there. So there's almost a conflation of micromobility and shared micromobility. And micromobility is then typically understood as the new shared schemes that we see around bikes, around e-scooters, etc. Whereas there's a lot less kind of consideration of the long histories of micromobilities, of how long people have been cycling and walking and all the rest of it. That is often not included in these debates. And I think what is really important is that those two perspectives come together, that it is about the kind of, more long-standing forms of mobility that are often personally owned, but can also be informally shared, of course, and the kind of new ICT-enabled platformization, sharing economy type of approaches. And I think it's not the either or one is good or one is bad, but I think it's really important to see how all of those different ways, allow us to really rethink mobility. And I think they also unfold in many different ways across the globe. So some of those motorcycle taxi hailing apps operate sometimes in quite different ways as well. And for example, the pilot work I did in Ghana actually showed that a lot of the riders were not necessarily using those platforms, but they were much more reliant on things like WhatsApp. So I think there's there's really a huge variety of practices out there and of innovations and of different ways of how these things are taken up. And I think that is really interesting to focus on rather than to only see it as the one thing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Frauke, for that. Please do raise any questions if you cannot speak out. Also, feel free to pop them in the chat if you like. Yeah, there's a question from Shireen. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Frauke. That was a really interesting presentation, and I really also liked the way you were also pushing all the boundaries around, some of the mainstream definitions of what is disruptive and what is not. I think a bit related to that, something that made me think was around your comments that also a lot of the research so far has been very much focused on the global north, and I think global north is of course a very easier context maybe to research for micromobility. I think what you said about the main ambition being around emissions reduction and providing some public health benefit also as a result of facilitating micromobility is a very strong case in the global north. But I was really thinking if that is really the case for the global south, and is micromobility even delivering benefits as such for the global south, given that, as you indicated, there will be the more vulnerable sections of population, the poorer people usually that might use micromobility, and they have to breathe the very dirty air while using that micromobility, and that dirty air is produced by those who can actually afford a car. And then also, being in danger with all the other cars moving around them, and their lives really sometimes being at risk using these modes of micromobility. So I was really thinking, even, when we talk about micromobility in the global south, really the fundamental question for me was, is this even something beneficial when we think about those justice elements, and is it something that we would want to facilitate or advocate for in that context, which is very different to the global north?
Yeah, fantastic question. Thank you very much. And it's definitely something I think needs a lot more attention. So there can't be an assumption because it's good for public health. In the countries that have been most studied, it's good for public health as well. And especially in terms of risk of injury and life. And yeah, as you mentioned, breathing in pollution, etc. So I think that needs a lot of attention. But I guess also what I really ultimately would like to get at is, of course, the more we invest, or not we, but the more investments get made into automobility infrastructure, the more this gets exacerbated, which are, of course, only benefiting a certain proportion of the population. So kind of the more automobility gets developed, the more micromobility gets marginalized in a way. And I think that's really what I want to also highlight here, and that it's not about putting in a nice cycle path along the beach where tourists can use a shared bike, like, for example, happened in Rio de Janeiro, rather than making, for example, shared micromobility available for the people who live far away and need to get to work in the rich neighborhoods. Yeah, so I think there's a lot to be done there, and we can't make any of those assumptions. And maybe connecting to some of the data issues I mentioned, of course, we have very little data on injury and death around micromobility in many of these countries. But where we do have them, they are terrible. And that is really important. So yeah, the justice issue is not straightforward, and the public health issue isn't straightforward. There's been an interesting report by the United Nations on walking and cycling in Africa that picks out some of these issues, came out last year. Thanks.
Thanks, Shireen and Frauke. And we've got now a question from Mayida Rashid. Please feel free to unmute yourself and possibly show yourself if you like.
Hi, it was an amazing presentation. Particularly, I really enjoyed because I am from Bangladesh.
You're the expert then.
Yeah, it's but I grew up and lived most of my life in a village, small village, and then I came to Dhaka for do my higher studies and then work. So in terms of this e-rickshaw, from my observation, I want to share a few things, and if there was scope for your research to include these things. So micromobility is definitely does have lots of positive things, but in Bangladesh, especially in summer, there's a local term called load shedding, which is power outage. It's almost like every alternate hour. You will have 2 hour electricity, 1 hour outage, or even half of the day you don't have power. So I went to Bangladesh after 5 years after COVID and in my village and in summer. And I was telling my mom why this is so many power out, like load sheddings a day now. So from my mom's observations, she said, because now we have lots of it's lots of local name for this e-bike in the village. They call Moyurpanki. So lots of local name because there are lots of e-bikes now, and they use like a local family electricity for it. So it definitely increased the number of power outage time, and also it actually somehow promote child labor because now it's so easy. I'm sharing this because you had lots of so I'm a social scientist, and it's amazing to see. This is a bit of a technical research about how you bring social science aspects in this, and it does have increased child labor, and kids are leaving school now in the village before even completing grade 8 because it's easy for parents to organize a e-bike, and it's easy, even a child can use this. So it is an observation, but there could be research can prove this. And also because now they are not trained, accident has increased. There are definitely many accidents. So it's like is there any scopes to see the other parts of the micromobility?
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard about this. The work that Jonas has done has mainly been kind of on the suburbs of Dhaka. So this would be really interesting to follow up. I mean, some of the things he flagged up that, of course, most of the electricity is generated by coal-powered plants.
Yeah.
That's obviously a big issue. And also the batteries being used are lead acid batteries because of the local production infrastructure for that in the country. So there's no kind of, it's not the amazing thing. But I think it's, what I was trying to argue is that it's happening faster and more profoundly than what we often understood as the kind of beacons of e-mobility. Like, Norway, for example, everyone talks about Norway, but not many people talk about Bangladesh as being the front runners in kind of e-mobility transformation.
Yeah, it was so good to see that I did it on Bangladesh.
But yeah, I'm definitely lots of problematic issues, and thank you so much. I really didn't know that it also kind of promotes, people leaving school early and getting into the business around this earlier. So yeah, if you're interested to do some work around that.
I would love to.
Yeah.
If there is any way to involve with your research, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, please. I can't quite see everything here on Zoom. So, if anyone would like to email me afterwards to just say hi, that would be really helpful as well. Thank you.
How can we get your email?
I will put it in the chat.
Thanks.
I found the chat. There we are.
And also feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to help with making the connections as well. But there you go. That's the email. The great question, Maida. And This sort of remind me of sort of constructive technology assessment kind of debates where any new innovation or technology is likely to create new risks and dependencies, which often do require new types of regulation as well. So this is an example, I think, of where promising technologies for various reasons also create new risks and issues, and that needs to be regulated in some way. So great question. Thanks for that. Are there any other questions from anyone in the audience? If not, I've got a few others myself. So I guess one of the questions relates back to Shireen's point, and I've been doing some research some time ago in India and Thailand myself, which was more related to distributed energy generation, and going into some of the rural areas and speaking to people that sort of were very far away from electric grids. They obviously would be great benefits that these distributed energy systems could bring to them. But somewhat surprisingly, and probably because of my own naiveness, there were many participants who were actually quite critical, and they said, well, why are we getting these sort of small scale technologies? We should be connected to the national grid, just like the urban elite. And I guess I wonder if there's something similar in your case where maybe people on micromobilities, they feel they are using those because they don't have an alternative, but aspirations really are to get a car because that's what you do when you become more, you get more income. So I wonder, have you come across around that? And I guess this is also maybe one of the, I think you briefly spoke about politicians not really willing to support these developments, and they might be sort of politically aware of the perceptions or what they perceive as the dominant perceptions in the community. So any reflections on that point?
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. Two bits there, and I think to move away from the aspiration to automobility is the holy grail. What I do think is interesting that in the West, at least, we see now aspiration and ownership of cars, of course, going down with the younger generation, and people valuing a new smartphone over owning a car. I think that's an interesting development. And I think also some of the new forms of micromobility, such as the electric scooters, are also more seen like a gadget and are maybe slightly more aspirational than some of the older forms and the kind of hipster bicycle thing. So I think there are some shifts happening, but that's definitely not happening around the globe. And it's also not supported around the globe. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there that is cultural, that is not about the technologies. And then secondly, you kind of started off with the energy. And what is quite interesting, there's quite a big company, I've forgotten the name of it now, in Bangladesh that installs also these kind of distributed solar energy systems, very successful. And they have now teamed up or kind of tapped into this trend of electrification of rickshaws. So they kind of sell this all in one package of get your solar cells sorted as a community, and at the same time charge up all your electric vehicles and pay them off over time. So it's also interesting again to see the kind of multi-system element there. And then people, of course, manage all of that through their smartphones. And personally, I would be really interested how those kinds of initiatives might really create some change as well, and maybe also shift some of those perceptions, both around the kind of distributed energy and the mobility. But yeah, I know I'm an optimist. And I'd be very keen to actually go out and do some more of the research myself, because I'm at very, very early stages there.
Have you ever considered reconsidering the notion of micromobility itself, in the sense that the wording might be a little bit unfortunate? I know why. I mean, you talk about micromobility because these are they're smaller, and but does it keep things small as well? Like, is this part of the perception that this is just something that isn't able to deliver the large scale mobility demands of major cities and so on?
Interesting. Haven't come across that as a small, as in marginal kind of thing. Have you come across that?
No, not in this form. I've come across other challenges when you transpose certain, let's say, Western terminologies into other contexts, and they have very different kinds of connotations. As you know, we've done a lot of work on niches and experimentation as a strategy in shifting systems towards sustainability, and those notions don't always go very well, because you get responses like, "Why are we being experimented with?" Which is a good point. So being careful about the kind of language that we bring with us as research is quite important.
Yeah,
that's what I've got to learn.
Yeah, no, good point. I mean, I think some of the kind of more established terms like active mobility are really being challenged here because we have so many motors involved, so that doesn't quite work. And then the kind of non-motorized equally doesn't quite cut it. And it's also kind of the opposition that I find tricky. So I'm kind of hoping this might be a bit of a bridging term, I suppose, to bring together some of these elements. But yeah, new terms, very welcome. Please apply.
Yeah, it could also be interesting to just see what terminology is used in a country like Bangladesh and how that translates back into maybe English, and see whether that gives any interesting insights.
Absolutely.
So we're starting to reach the end of this seminar. I just want to see if there's anyone wants to raise one final comment or question to Frauke. This is your chance. And if not, then I would like to thank you very much, Frauke, for a great, interesting presentation. It will be great to actually see those 18 publications that you listed from Monash University. It would be quite welcome to know who those people are, and maybe establish a bit of a local network ourselves if that doesn't exist yet. So thank you for traveling all the way down here and giving this great presentation to us. And feel free to reach out to Frauke or myself if you want to further have any interactions on this topic. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.